Hi, everyone. My name is Ed Hale, and I'm with the Delaware Sea Grant Marine Advisory Service. I'm a marine advisory specialist with that group that specializes in fisheries and aquaculture and seafood. And so today I'm going to be talking to you about aquatic invaders, specifically invasive fishes. So just to give you a little bit of professional background, I have a Bachelor's of Science degree in marine science and a PhD in marine bioscience. I spent some time as a commercial fisheries observer and data processor for the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission. I worked with the Park Service for a stint. I've held 3 adjunct faculty positions now at this point. But right prior to coming to Sea Grant, I was actually a diathermist and marine species management specialist with the State Fisheries Office. As such, I was a biometrician, so I attempted to work with regional groups to essentially figure out spawning stock biomass so that we could then set appropriate management measures to essentially keep our fisheries sustainable. And so that was my prior role. And now, as I said, I'm engaged in extension education and applied research with Sea Grant. And so it's a little bit different, but I get to talk to groups directly. So it's a lot of fun for me. So before we begin, we should probably talk about what a fish is. And so most of you probably have an idea of what a fish looks like. Loosely defined, they're essentially aquatic vertebrates that have gills throughout their life and limbs, if they have limbs, in the shape of fins. They're generally covered in scales, although there's exceptions to all rules, particularly with fishes. In fact, most catfishes actually don't have scales. They're generally pocothermic. There are some exceptions, including billfish, which have modified heater organs to warm up the eye area, and tuna, which have countercurrent heat exchangers. And so, generally speaking, a fish is just an aquatic vertebrate with gills and limbs in the shape of fins. And so, just providing a definition to that. We might ask ourselves, where does our seafood essentially originate? And so there's essentially 4 pathways for seafood delivery to our door. They can include wild harvest capture fisheries from either the marine or freshwater sector, or aquaculture in freshwater or marine aquaculture. So you might ask yourself, of course, what is a fishery? Well, a fishery is generally considered any activity that leads to the harvesting of fish. And it can include wild harvest, or it can include aquaculture. And so aquaculture is just essentially engaging in an act that essentially is helping to cultivate an individual fish. And so there's a lot of different ways to define that, but just generally speaking, a fishery is any act or activity that leads to fish harvest. Another important concept for us to potentially consider in this presentation is ecology, and ecology is simply the study of interactions between organisms and as well as their environment. And so it can be biotic and abiotic. So abiotic environmental components can be things like temperature and salinity. And these processes and interactions can vary greatly in space and time scales. And so it includes things like predator-prey dynamics, competition, and parasitism. Competition, predator-prey dynamics are definitely things that we're going to see in terms of some of the invasive fish species that we're going to talk about today within the state of Delaware. Also recruitment, transport, settlement, feeding rates and growth, mortality, and fecundity. So ecology is essentially a study of all of these interacting processes. And as you can see through this essentially trophic flow or food web, you can see this base and then forage fish and predators, and then humans acting as apex predators in a similar manner. And you can see energy essentially moving from a phytoplankton base up through fisheries production. And so we are not free, humans, from being involved in an ecological context. When we consider some of our environmental concerns, we can essentially rank 4 of them, and we see that invasive species are actually fairly high in terms of what we should potentially be considering for environmentally sensitive issues. Right below the alteration and destruction of habitat and below marine pollution. So definitely something that we need to pay attention to. They can have a number of ecosystem effects by altering food webs. And as I just showed you, because of the ecological interactions, which can then lead to broad-scale environmental damage, as well as economic costs. And so we'll talk about some of those today. We should also talk about the difference between an introduced and an invasive species. An introduced species is essentially a non-native species with a reproducing population that is established in a new region. It can be established intentionally or unintentionally, but it's not essentially negative in the environmental sense. And we can consider channel catfish into this category. They weren't actually native to the Delaware area, but they've been introduced, and they are essentially in a steady state equilibrium with the natural environment. And then we can consider what we would characterize as invasive. And so this is an introduced species that spreads beyond its own biological introduction and causes harm to native species or ecosystems. And these represent significant threats to biodiversity around the globe. And so what can be considered invasive? Invasive species span all domains. This can be bacteria, plants, algae, crustaceans, mollusks, fish, phytoplankton, zooplankton, and many more different taxonomic groups. But today, because I'm the fisheries and aquaculture specialist, I'm going to be talking to you about some of our invasive fish species. When we consider broad-scale distribution of invasive species, we can actually look at the number of known harmful or alien species and see that in the United States, at least in the continental US, there is definitely a higher number of invasive species on the West Coast than there are on the East Coast, and then definitely around Great Britain and Ireland. And so certainly we have some invasive species on the eastern seaboard, but it's not as high when we compare it to our western coast. So how are species relocated? There's a number of different transport pathways. The number one, at least proportionally most significant transport pathway would actually be shipping. And so this can be unintentional in ballast water of ships, can also be biofouling. Then we can get to aquaculture. And so this is either accidental release of aquaculture reared animals or some sort of hurricane event or some sort of environmental perturbation that has essentially damaged aquaculture production and released non-native species into a native water body. And then the aquarium trade, which is another interesting phenomenon. We've linked some lionfish releases to aquarium trades being damaged during hurricanes. And so we've definitely seen this type of event where a hurricane will come into an area and essentially flood an area, destroy a store, and so then you get the subsequent release of cultivated fish and different organisms. There can also be relocations associated with canal construction and the live seafood trade. And so food sources and biocontrol are two pathways that we can actually label as intentional. So if somebody's releasing a species into a waterway for a food source to grow it, that is definitely an intentional pathway. And similarly, if somebody's using a fish for biocontrol in a private pond or something like that, then that's definitely, yet again, another intentional mechanism of relocation. When we look at ballast water, this is, if we consider ballast, any material used to weight and or balance a ship, we can actually look at ballast water, and it's been used since the 1880s, and it involves the exchange of about 10 billion tons of water per year. And what it does is, as you can see on the diagram on the right, essentially the ship will load ballast water at a source port. It will hold it then to ensure stability and structural integrity of the ship as it travels through the ocean. Then when it gets to the destination port, it actually discharges this water, and the ballast tanks are empty. And so what that does is it creates this transport pathway for organisms that are uptaked at a given port and then discharged at the port destination. And so this is how these organisms can actually be transported in ballast water. And as you see, 10 billion tons is actually a fairly significant amount of water. When we consider the impact that invasive species make, they can be ecological, so they can change ecosystem function. They are definitely a significant threat to biodiversity and remain one of the greatest threats to marine biodiversity that we know of. There's also an economic cost, an estimated cost of $1.4 trillion globally just to manage some of these animals and some of their, essentially mitigating some of their damage points or the issues that we've had with them. And then there's human health. So there's a range of diseases that can be caused by non-native introductions and these organisms. One of the characteristic key examples that we like to point out is zebra mussels. So this is a freshwater mollusk that was actually native to the Caspian and Black Sea. As you see in the picture, it's actually relatively small. And what they do is they are incredibly dense. They settle in extremely high densities, and they will essentially clog up intake and discharge waters, which significantly impacts freshwater movement into and out of industrial use facilities. And so places that are reliant on incoming water for cooling operations and then discharge waters have to spend a great deal of money to essentially eradicate this animal in localized pockets, so they do their best to essentially manage it. And you can see on the bottom right, it's a clogged boat prop. And so the outflow, the exhaust, is going to be significantly impaired. And so it really negatively impacts performance of shipping traffic and some vessels. Unfortunately, there's no known eradication effort for the zebra mussel, and you can see essentially the distribution. So the zebra mussel was originally introduced into the Great Lakes, and then it's essentially been disseminated throughout the eastern seaboard. And you can see it traveling down the Mississippi River, and essentially is spread out quite quickly. And we can't kill it fast enough, and it's having millions and millions of dollars of damage to shipping industries, to discharge waters, and so really significant toll. It's also creating some ecological issues that we can see. And so really dense, as I said, about 70,000 per square meter. And so really high density. They can reduce phytoplankton by up to 80%, which creates less food for native bivalve species. They increase water clarity, which can be a good thing. So it enhances light penetration, but that increases benthic algal and plant growth. And so it alters the existing food web and trophic structure. And on top of that, they overgrow native mollusks. And you can see in this picture to the right, zebra mussels are just essentially overtaken this clan. And so they outcompete the native species. And so in doing so, they can actually promote harmful algal blooms, which are really significant. So that's certainly a negative ecological impact of the zebra mussel. There's also a number of economic impacts. The cost alone is expected or is estimated to be around $1 billion in the United States. And so one of the things that has done is essentially discourage recreation and tourism. So there's this ancillary impact on the outside of this ecological invasion. And so there's now marketing efforts to essentially stop aquatic hitchhikers so that you're not transferring these animals between pond to pond and freshwater sources. And so a lot of heavy economic burden associated with these invasive species. Next, we can talk about another example called the lionfish. And so this was a native species to the Indo-Pacific, and it was introduced to South Florida in the 1980s. It spread to the Caribbean and the northwestern Atlantic relatively rapidly and has actually been documented off the Delaware shore. There's no known natural predators in our ecosystem, anyway, at least in the mid-Atlantic region. And the issue with this is that they are essentially a voracious predator of other juvenile fish. They have a toxic fin, so it actually discharges the venom. And so fish that would actually attempt to consume this oftentimes are injected with this venom and die. And so really hardy, resilient fish. It's in a new environment where it has no known natural predators, as opposed to its native environment, Indo-Pacific, where there were predators that would essentially control the population rate. And so at this point, there's no population level control for this species. And so it's essentially just been allowed to propagate and disperse, as we'll see, from the Caribbean up into the New England region. And so this is a map of the spread of the lionfish. And you can actually see its release in the 1985 area of southern Florida at the darkest point. And then it just sort of emanates outward. And it's been found in the Caribbean down to South America, the Gulf of Mexico, and as I said, all the way up to New England. And it's recently been found offshore off of Delaware waters. And so definitely an issue we see in our offshore waters. Now we're going to go to some species that freshwater anglers are definitely going to see. So this species, we don't believe it's in Delaware Bay. It tends to favor offshore environments from what we know about it. So really the only people that have interacted with it have been scuba divers. But next we're going to move into our freshwater species. And so this is where freshwater anglers definitely have an opportunity to interact with some of these species. And so northern snakehead is perhaps a really good example of an invasive species in Maryland and Delaware. Was originally found to be established. It's been verified by collections of gravid females in a range of size ranges in the Potomac River. It's found in Crofton, Maryland. And so since the original collection, the population has expanded throughout Chesapeake Bay watershed, been introduced into Delaware waters in recent years. And the species has been found to prey upon native forage species and displace as sport fish like largemouth bass that contribute millions of dollars to our local economies. And so northern snakehead now have this global distribution, but are really native to Eastern Asia and thought to have been introduced from live fish markets. So this is an example of a direct introduction for food fish purposes or for food purposes, which is unfortunate because it's had pretty significant ecological consequence. And so despite being smaller in total length than blue catfish and flathead catfish, which are two species that we're going to talk about next, northern snakehead can actually attain sizes in excess of 800 millimeters, so they're approaching nearly a meter in length, and they can weigh up to 5 kilograms. On top of that, they're extremely aggressive and highly piscivorous, so they're really quite good at capturing prey, and they're very aggressive, and they like to eat. And so although the direct consumption of diadromous fishes, so fish like river herring, has not been documented, or doesn't appear common rather, northern snakeheads have been found to exhibit significant dietary overlap with largemouth bass. And so this gets back to our ecological concepts. We're now talking about competition. So essentially largemouth bass are being outcompeted by an invasive species that doesn't have any known natural predators. And so they occupy a similar niche or a role in the ecosystem, and they occupy similar habitats to largemouth bass as they like structure, and so that essentially limits local sport fish. So northern snakehead have been suggested to pose one of the greatest threats to the aquatic ecosystems of the United States because of their aggressive nature, growth rate, and tolerance to low temperatures, as well as ice coverage. So it's definitely a problematic species for us and for the country, really. Snakeheads tend to prefer shallow, stagnant, slow-moving streams or ponds with heavy vegetation. And they've been found in the Delaware River and the Nanticoke River in numerous stormwater ponds and at least 8 private ponds, including Banning Park Pond, Mudmill Pond, and in Beck's Pond. And Beck's Pond is pretty significant because it's one of the most popular public fishing grounds in the state of Delaware. And when we look at that, one of the things we want to do or we want to teach is that the northern snakehead does have a similar visual appearance to the bowfin. Bowfin is a native species, not related to it, and they're sometimes confused with northern snakeheads. But bowfin have an exceptionally short anal fin, as you can see on the ventral side of the animal. And when you compare that to northern snakeheads, they have this really long anal fin that almost reaches the caudal or the tail fin. And so under the ventral side, if you flip the animal over, the anal fin will stretch for pretty long distance. And so the natural expansion as well as the illegal stocking has really contributed to the spread of this species within the state. And unfortunately, once it's been established, it's relatively hardy, and so it's been quite difficult to eradicate. And it's made preventative measures actually crucial. And so DNREC, the State Fisheries Office, has a really active management program to attempt to essentially collect information and essentially educate folks about this animal, because they definitely don't want it spreading into other freshwater systems. Another species we can talk about that you may interact with as a freshwater angler in Delaware are a flathead catfish. And so flathead catfish are a large species of catfish. They're native to the southern Great Lakes and Mississippi drainage basins, as well as along waters of the Gulf of Mexico. And these fish can exceed 1 meter in total length and 50 kilograms in mass. And so they can weigh over 100 pounds. They can get relatively large. One issue we have is that channel catfish often get confused for flathead catfish, as well as blue cats that we're going to see next. But the channel catfish, a couple of the key characteristics to point out here are the rounded tail, as you can see in the picture on the bottom right, and the relatively flat sloped head. So it really does, it's really flat looking, and I'll show you in a picture on the next slide, it's actually quite pronounced. You can really see it. Lack of pronounced, but you can see just how flat it looks. And so flathead catfish prefer deep pools of streams, rivers, and canals where large woody debris or boulders can be found, and relatively moderate currents. Unlike other catfish that can be scavengers, flathead catfish are unique in that they prey upon only live prey. So they're extremely active, much like our northern snakehead. They're very aggressive in terms of their feeding regimen, and so they present a relatively significant problem. We have found them, or Denarec rather has found them to be caught around the first dam at West Street in the Brandywine River, as well as one specimen found from the C&D Canal. And so, as I said, these fish present a really significant problem. They tend to be found in fresher waters, but there has been documented cases in the C&D Canal. And in addition to the sizes that these fish can attain, flathead catfish have demonstrated really rapid dispersal and population growth rates. So they're really good at reproducing and dispersing out. And that has led to their successful invasion within waterways of the Mid-Atlantic Bight. And as I said before, they can be quite aggressive toward diadromous fish. And so these are generally fish that spend partial portions of the life cycle in fresh and salt water. The relative size and population growth of this species has led to serious concerns, particularly for management agencies like Denarec. And the adult flathead catfish feed almost exclusively, or extensively rather, on these native diadromous species, and these can include American shad, blueback herring, and alewife, and other prey species of significant economic concern, including blue crabs. And so they can have a really troubling direct effect. And what's upsetting is that the introduction of this species, flathead catfish, has been suggested as most likely done by recreational anglers for sport fishing purposes. And so that's a bit troubling, as they're having this really significant ecological impacts. And so now we definitely need to step up our educational campaign to make folks aware of what a negative consequence these fish can have for the environment and for our economy in terms of managing the damage that they produce. And so next we'll move on to blue cats. And blue catfish are similar to the flathead catfish in that they're considered to be very well established in Chesapeake Bay, and they've been documented within Delaware state waters, including the Delaware and Nanticoke rivers and the Christina River. Blue catfish are native to central and southern United States, as well as the Gulf Coast, streams from Alabama to Belize. And this species was initially stocked in the freshwater reaches of several Chesapeake Bay tributaries in the 1970s and 1980s, and has since expanded to tidal portions of the estuary. So this is a fish that has a little bit broader habitat range, moving outside of just freshwater reaches. So blue cats are a larger fish. They occur at channel drop-offs and creek mouths. These fish are actually pretty opportunistic, and they'll eat a various number of fish species. We don't believe they're as significant in terms of what they consume for diadromous fish species, but I would certainly suspect that they are consuming diadromous fishes, just at not as high a proportion as what we see in flathead catfish. And so blue catfish common dietary items include gizzard shad, crayfish, and freshwater mussels. And as I said, they're found in the Delaware, Nanticoke, and Christina River. Blue catfish have been found to get exceptionally large at 1.6 meters and weigh 45 kilograms. So again, this is approaching nearly 100 pounds, and it represents the largest catfish within the United States. And so blue catfish tend to have a more variable diet, but they still have a really negative impact because they grow so large and they eat so many different things. And so while they're not as significant in terms of per capita consumption on Holocene or some of our diadromous fishes, when compared to the flathead catfish, blue catfish also have a really significant component and will consume some of our river herring and shad, definitely. So certainly something that we have to keep an eye on, and definitely something that state and regional management agencies want to help essentially curtail the more rapid dispersal of this fish species. And as you can see, it's got a relatively popular sport fishing component to it. These are fish taken from Delaware, as you can see. And so there are folks that will go out and target these. And so just make a recommendation that if you do encounter one of these fish, please in fact kill it. And so how can you help This is my last slide, so this is just essentially my key information. These fish are invasive and negatively impacting our environment. And so this is my essentially call to you to please help. Please do not return them to the water. In fact, you are asked to immediately kill them and contact the Delaware Division of Fish and Wildlife at 302-739-9914 to report this animal so that we can essentially stop the spread of it, as well as essentially curtail future dispersal and hopefully help mitigate some of the environmental damage that we've been experiencing.